Thank you, Lisa K. Welcome back from the breakout groups. The motivation for having the breakout groups is that we had received pointed feedback from earlier summits that the audience wants to be engaged or wants to contribute, and that's why we facilitated this. Thanks, Lisa K. and Joy, for managing that process. I'd like to thank all the moderators. I would like to invite each of the moderators for the 7 sessions to give a challenging 45-second summary of your sessions. Just highlight mention the names of the topics that you discussed, and the student scribes in each of the breakout rooms will summarize and will craft together a document that will be distributed to everybody. So let's start with group number 1. Jen, you know how to do this.
All right, I will try, and I think I'm going to do it in verbal bullet points. So in terms of the the topics, we were redefining the role of the curb, and some of the topics and themes within that include AVs, biking, walking, rolling, accessibility, ADA, ride share vehicles, delivery share vehicles, personal delivery devices, and sort of new micro-mobility. So wide range of scales and sizes and purposes of using the curb, and transit. Let's not forget transit. We talked about different contexts of doing this in more urban and suburban areas. Some of the issues include sort of monetizing use of the curb, and how to set policy and planning for the curb. And then in terms of research, we came up with 5 buckets. 1 dealing with sort of best practices and how to manage. 1 dealing with data collection to understand how the curb is actually being used. Simulation and modeling to understand how to manage a curb to be safe and meet other objectives. Public engagement issues and the need for multidisciplinary research on this topic. And finally, sort of the co-benefits of managing the curb, things like economic development for a commercial area. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jen. Excellent summary. You set the example for what the others should do. Next is Mansoreh, Jeihani.
Yes, so we talked about connected autonomous vehicles. We talked about the issues and gaps on the current practices and research, and also mostly we talked about equity and accessibility, and how CAVs can help equity and accessibility. We had discussions about government and industry involvement and how we can leverage industry and to make government go faster, and having more of the roadside units and infrastructure to accommodate connected autonomous vehicles. We also talked about some personally owned vehicles, CAVs, as opposed to the shared ones, and some of the unintended consequences of having each of those. And we talked about a little bit of the safety and equity, and also some about the workforce development and opportunities job opportunities that CAV can bring, and especially to minorities, people with disabilities, women, and so on. I think that's it.
Thank you, Mansoreh. The next is Victoria Deguzman.
Great, I'm unmuted, thank you. We had quite a lively discussion. We highlighted many concerns that we had for a goods movement, including the projected and experienced increase in freight, the emission reduction concerns and alternate fuels that may help with that, the resilience of the supply chain, safety, the shortage of workers and particularly truck drivers, delays that we're experiencing in delivery, We noted the lack of parking in the infrastructure bill and thought that was something we should definitely be thinking about. An overriding issue, as I mentioned a moment ago, is changing the truck fleet to alternative fuels, which will be, of course, a very long process. And something interesting we noticed, or we mentioned, that the increase in e-commerce, goods movement, need for goods movement is often inconsistent with the current planning, which tends to focus on complete streets and sort of bringing in other modes of transport, which tend to conflict or often conflict with goods movement goals. In terms of equity implications, we noted that the communities who tend to be negatively impacted most by goods movement tend to be those of lower income, of color, and there are many equity implications for that, in particular when it comes to the environmental concerns and air quality. Existing research on the topic and what do we need? We decided one very important thing to look at is the relative lack of data. We did notice that, note that TRB has been holding a series of freight data webinars and thought that that was a move in a very good direction. Regarding what we need for education and student engagement, we noted that we are sorely in need of goods movement workers, trained, ready to work employees at all levels, trained and retrained employees. We need to replace the increasing numbers of retirees. We need to bring up the current workforce to a standard that they can operate at the new technology levels. So recruiting, training, and retraining is needed desperately. And finally, we had a participant from the rail industry on our panel who very astutely noted that the rail industry would be a very good potential partner to help explore the topic. He admitted that, of course, they are not the last mile delivery, but they certainly could do a lot to contribute to the needs for longer haul. In particular, the rail industry themselves have been looking at alternate fuels, noting that locomotives are long-lived. That can be a challenge, but also an opportunity. If we are able to find alternative fuels for locomotives, we have a long-lasting solution.
Thank you, Victoria. Next is Shri Iyer on public transportation and transportation networks.
Yeah, so we had a small group. We focused largely on what I would call the intersectionality between transit and different societal issues. For example, we talked about equity, accessibility, especially for people with disabilities, including both for traditional public transportation as well as transit network companies or TNCs. Some of this financial equities, homelessness, and different issues that are being borne out through our public transportation system that need more attention. Specifically now with the recovery from COVID, the pandemic, and how they sort of devastated our transit agencies financially and ridership-wise, there was some discussion about what should the performance metrics we be looking at, and that's an area that the university community researchers can really contribute. You know, our ridership and bang for the buck kind of from fare box recovery ratio is really the most important thing we should be looking at, or how we're serving society more generally. We brought up kind of the lack of attention in general that transit has been getting from the research community or over the last few decades, and what we could do to kind of reverse that and kind of make transit cool again in a way, as our cities and the federal policy is focusing more towards non-car dominated cities. But part of that is that our domestic transit agencies seem to be a little bit behind in many cases from some other countries, and the advances in technology are tough to bring them the proverbial last mile to implementation in our transit systems, and that the university has a role to play there. And finally, we spoke at length about the tension between the TNCs and traditional transit operations, and what researchers should be doing and how best that researchers and policymakers can be focused on driving, good decisions on making them work together rather than making them work against each other. And, the role that the university community, the UTC program can really take there.
Thank you, Shri. David Kack, rural challenges.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we had a good group of about a dozen people. And I think we talked about a lot of the previous topics, but to say, what does it mean in a rural environment? So, you know, we don't talk first mile, last mile. We talk the first 25 miles and last 25 miles. We talked about the differences in safety, and that the rates of fatal crashes are higher in rural areas, and some of the things behind that. We talked about how the pandemic really highlighted the digital divide. And as we talk about things like connected and autonomous vehicles, do we even have the infrastructure of communications technology and some of those things in rural areas? We talked about funding issues, and as we talked about some of these things like transportation network companies, that in rural areas the business model just probably doesn't make sense, even for things like car sharing and bike sharing. So we talked about, are there demonstration projects or pilot projects you can do in rural areas to say how you do this might be different, but you can have car sharing and bike sharing and something like a TNC in a very rural area. So I think it was a good conversation as we talked about, you know, equity from also investing in rural areas. You know, oftentimes when you just look at sheer numbers, you say, well, I'm going to invest where there's a lot of people, and that's not in rural areas, but the need is certainly there. You know, through the routes initiative, USDOT did a good job of trying to say what resources are out there that certainly rural communities compete for some of that funding to get their fair share of it. Unfortunately, it didn't put more money into rural areas, but to say these programs are out there and you know, put in proposals, compete for it. The other thing we talked about is there's a National Cooperative Highway Research Project, NCHRP 20-122, the Rural Research Roadmap. And so that should be published soon and discuss a lot of these topics, as well as what has to be done in rural areas. But kind of, again, some of the similar discussions, but just saying, let's look at it through that rural lens.
Thank you, David. Next is active transportation. Hillary Nixon will summarize.
Great, thanks, and huge thanks to participants in our room and to our note taker who did such a wonderful job. So I think that the kind of broad framework we were focused on was really how active transportation can improve, can provide improved mobility and accessibility. In terms of themes, David, you'll be pleased that rural and suburban areas were a major theme. We see that a lot of the focus on active transportation has been in urbanized areas. So how do we broaden those research opportunities, our policy work out to suburban and rural communities? What role could e-bikes and e-assist play in terms of providing more access to active transportation? Another kind of key area of conversation focused on equity, and particularly for communities of color. The idea that there is still a stigma in some communities about using bikes, transit, active transportation modes, but also there's a real personal safety issue that faces people of color when they're out and about. And I'm sure we don't need to go into some of the incredibly tragic results and outcomes of that. We focused on kind of this canary in a coal mine analogy, and that when you don't see people out walking, biking, that is a sign that there is something wrong within that community in terms of whether it is infrastructure, lighting, improved opportunities for connectivity. How do you really build an active transportation system that serves all communities? From an education perspective, we kind of covered the gamut from, you know, public education, the K-12 system, you know, how do you embed active transportation education in our K-12 at the university? How do you start thinking more about cross-training, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary training? A great example of UMass is engineers as public health professionals. How do we kind of start young, where you're building a mindset of active transportation users that then become into the professionals that design, develop, and manage our systems? For workshops for university professionals to integrate active transportation education into multiple disciplines. We also talked about experiential education, and not just for students, but for policymakers, law enforcement professionals, and elected officials. What is it like to spend a day, a week, a month, using active transportation as your only mode of getting around? For all of these educational programs, how do we integrate a racial equity lens? We have research and data that talks about who is the most harmed, but that often doesn't get into our curriculum. Briefly on funding, we talked a little bit about the proposed new federal legislation that's got incentives for EVs. How do we broaden that out, not just for vehicles, but for e-bikes, other micromobility devices as well. We also talked about the fact that the U.S. has a user fee model where people pay a gas tax and they get something back, and that many other countries have transitioned how they tax. So they tax things almost as a bad thing to discourage the use. So think about cigarette taxes or carbon taxes. Can we do that same thing for driving? If we think of funding as an expression of priorities, how do you change those priorities? It was a great session. I could go on, but I know that we need to transition to the next group. So huge thanks to all of my participants.
Thank you, Hilary. Last but not the least, Khan Osbey.
I'm on mute. Okay, hi. So we had a relatively small group of 6-7 people, but we had a good discussion, and mainly we talked about our experience during COVID, and one consensus is that COVID was almost like looking into the future, given the climate change and so on, in terms of like a big disruption to our system. So that was kind of a learning in almost like a controlled environment. So that was one thing that we discussed. And then the other thing is COVID there's a feeling that accelerated the transition to like a more digital world in terms of education, mobility, work, and so on. So we learned from that. On the other hand, if we compare it to something that happened 20 years ago, 9/11, we they were kind of lucky about having internet available at the level that it is right now, smartphones and so on. So we were able to cope with COVID much more effectively. So those are, some of the things that we looked at, and then I kind of wanted to get feedback from everyone if they had to look at a research problem based on the experience in COVID, what would be the interesting things. And of course, one would be how to study the effect of COVID on transportation demand. Are all the trips going to come back? So that's an interesting area of research that can be looked at. The other one is how do we use this data that's now becoming more and more available for decision making in a situation like COVID. And then one thing that came up that maybe we couldn't say before the COVID crisis is that many agencies, they adopted, they accelerated their construction and so on. And that was evidence, anecdotal obviously, but there's a need to look into that, how they were adopting fast and how they were building at a level that they were building during the COVID, taking advantage of the lower traffic levels and so on. But I think that might be a good lesson learned for for researchers and other agencies into the future. So the other thing is that the behavior, human behavior, is it going to really change as a result of COVID? For example, are people still going to go to conferences? Our students are going to go to classes? So there is really no like a final answer, one answer for this, but there are kind of hypotheses. So can we really study that? And obviously it will affect the way we do transportation planning, the way we do our education planning and so on, and what will be the effect of that. So I think that was something that everybody is interested. And then the other thing is that behavior will be affected by the maturity of the technology, and also how people adopt, how, for example, teachers adopt, how professors adopt, and how conferences adopt. So this is another thing that kind of interesting to see. So finally, COVID also provided a situation where, for example, very low AADTs, traffic volumes that we could use to understand the safety effects. So because this is some situation we couldn't create on a regular time, so there's a need to kind of look at these very special traffic conditions and see their effects on safety and on other problems that we deal on a day-to-day basis, and then make some improve our understanding. So I mean, that was pretty much some of the points that we discussed, and I think there's a lot of ideas.
Thank you, Khan. Thanks for the good summary. Let me thank all the moderators and the participants for their active participation in these breakout groups. We had student scribes in each of the groups. They will work with the moderators, and we'll produce a summary document to post on the web.